right, welcome to the Aetherica podcast, the podcast for the modern philosopher magician. I'm Sky Mathis, joined with magician Ike Baker. And today we're going to dive into the Vatican as well as the Society of Jesus, aka the Jesuit order, and other pertaining subject matters. So to jump into it, speaking about the Jesuits, at least modern day, they comprise a conglomerate of about 17,000 worldwide, approximately. There's a vast variety of opinions, speculations, interest in this group from all different angles. So I just thought it would be awesome and fun for me and Ike to talk about this. Um, I've heard a claim a few times as the Jesuits as being primarily responsible for the change in the name of Yeshua to Jesus. I don't know if that's true, but it seems plausible. And I kind of wanted to ask you and get your opinion or your thoughts on that. Like the changing of the name Yeshua to Jesus, like what's up with this whole idea and how did it come about in your estimation, if you have any thoughts on that? I know that's maybe it's like a translation thing, perhaps. But I think it's really interesting. The historical figure, Jesus, his name in Hebrew, I guess, was Yeshua. And when it goes into the Greek, it ends up as Iesus. You could probably pronounce that in the correct
Jesus.
way. Okay. And then the Latin is Iesus, which in English I've read would actually translate to Joshua. So there's that, and seems a little confusing to me, but I don't know enough about that kind of thing to be honest. But I wonder also, like maybe to your knowledge, was it common for New Testament figures' names to end up completely different than the originals, like this sort of thing, or different figures, or yeah, any of that stuff I'm curious about.
Well, so concerning Jesus's name, one major point of clarification that I feel like I continually have to make is that all of the New Testament writings, right? So the things of and pertaining to Jesus and the sayings of Jesus, his ministry on earth for a time, and the acts of his apostles, and basically everything surrounding and sort of just after the quote unquote Christ event, right? It all came to us in Greek. So when people say that, Jesus's original name in Hebrew, well, that wouldn't have been the case because the language they spoke was Aramaic. And it was never written, as far as we're aware. We have no gospels in Hebrew. We have some apocryphal texts that are, I believe, in Coptic, which is a form of late kingdom Egyptian that is derived heavily from Greek. There's plenty of Greek letters in there, and it was a product of this Hellenistic syncretism in Alexandria, primarily, right after Alexander the Great and under Roman rule. And in the interim period in the reign of the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty, it was a sort of Greco-Egyptian thing. And so we see various forms of early Christianities really living in that space and growing out of that soil. It's very interesting. The Coptic population there is one of the earliest Mediterranean Christian churches to rise. I mean, it's the largest minority population in Egypt, and it is even to the current day, it's the largest Christian population in the Muslim world. So you've got a lot of activity going on there, and they're not writing and speaking in Hebrew, and particularly around, in the Roman province of Judea, they would have spoken Aramaic. So there's like a big fallacy that Jesus' name was ever written in Hebrew. If we're talking about historicity, sure, I'm sure somewhere his name was written during his lifetime in Hebrew or some sort of Semitic script, proto-Semitic, Semitic script. But I mean, everything we know about Christ comes to us in Greek. So we can safely assume that, without interpolating, which means sort of projecting our own ideas of the thing onto what we actually have, and what is profoundly supported, is that his name, as recorded, was Jesus, just as it is in the Greek. I don't know what that translates to in Hebrew, to be honest with you. I don't think, especially deriving it out of the Latin, I mean, I don't see it being translated as Joshua. I see that as Yeshua or something like that instead of Jesus. But similar names, but they're all kind of derivative. There's a lot of similarities in plenty of names from that particular, socio-political milieu of that time and place.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I will say that as far as historical evidence for the translation of Christ's name into Yeshua seems to come more directly from the work of a Renaissance Kabbalist named an academic scholar, Johannes Reuchlin. And he was of the line of Christian Kabbalists, Pico della Mirandola and Athanasius Kircher, guys like this. So Johannes Reuchlin, he wrote a very influential book on the Christian Kabbalah called The Wonder-Working Word, and it was about Christ. And it's really from that text that particularly modern occult systems, curriculums, orders, they derive that, like in Martinism and in the inner order of the Golden Dawn, they're deriving Yeshua as Yod He Shin Vav He in Hebrew from Johannes Reuchlin and that work, to my knowledge. This was something that took me a while to figure out, right? Because I kind of worked my way backwards. I started out as a practitioner. I didn't start out as an academic. So I had to find out, where is this coming from? Symbolically, it makes a tremendous amount of sense as the fire of Shin sort of rending the veil of materiality. It's a very, very Gnostic idea there, right? You have the demiurge, according to Valentinian, Sethian, and Basilidian forms, Marcionite forms of Gnosticism, being the God of the Old Testament. Whose ineffable name was a formula, Yod He Vav He, that we render as Yahweh. They never spoke that name. They either say Adonai, meaning Lord, or Hashem, meaning the name. But Hebrews, particularly practicing pious Hebrews, they never utter that name. And so as symbolic, it's called the tetragrammaton, which translates to the four-lettered name, 4 letters, representing the 4 terrestrial elements. And then you have the Shin. You have Shin, which represents fire and spiritual fire, descending, being placed in the center of those 4 elements, sort of rending away out of materiality. So that was kind of this exposition that is derived from Il Verbo Mirifico, or the Wonder-Working Word, by Johannes Reuchlin. I am not necessarily 100%. So one thing to remember is that these guys weren't like, they're not like me. They weren't like me sitting here in like this room that they've, this library that they put together in their house, and kind of piecing this stuff together as some sort of independent researcher. They were within the mainstream of the academic institutions of their time. And so there was an academic tradition, right? Because this is around the 1500s. There is academic tradition that comes from these pioneering academics, right? I mean, if you look at one thing, it's like the educated people of that time were all clergy. They were all clergy. So there was no secular kind of like, hey, wait a minute. It's all their work is based in Christian, Judeo-Christian theology. All of it is based there. It is centered there. They approach everything through that lens, particularly of the medieval and Renaissance iteration of Christianity, Orthodox and particularly Catholic Christianity. And they're the academic mainstream. There is nothing else. Nothing else competes with them. There is no independent research. So from that tradition, kind of, it just stems forth. It's taken for granted. Yes, this is a sound philosophy. Yes, it's Yeshua. At a certain point, you have a break with religious and secular scholarship. Now we have the seminary, and we also have the secular universities. So it's kind of after that split, after a while, I want to say maybe mid 20th century, you start seeing this push to reassess the translation of Christ's name. And again, a lot of it comes from a let's look for the historical Jesus perspective, whereas that might not have always been the spirit in which certain academics had worked. So they were confined. They were confined to only, it's like the institution within which they operated, right? The church, under the auspices of the official church, gave them a pretty wide breadth. As long as you don't say these things, you don't violate these rules. I happen to think that the Christian Kabbalists, in looking back to particularly Athanasius Kircher, Pico della Mirandola, looking back to the Egyptian roots of the Judaic theology and cosmology from which Christianity grew forth, they kind of examining that's really the birth of modern esotericism. Let's go back to Egypt to see what they were talking about and see how it comes forth, and really the usage of the lineal glyph of the Kabbalistic tree of life to sort of graft everything onto. It's very esoteric. So I'm not, we can only speculate as to the spirit in which these academics and early esotericists worked in. We don't know if, maybe they looked at it more symbolically, but they just weren't allowed to voice that opinion. On the other hand, it's very clear they feel very strong about the idea of the Christ and the supremacy of that New Testament dispensation. So those are my thoughts on the name of Christ. I'm not certain if the Jesuits were behind that push. I will say that the Jesuits are more historically have been and still are within the seminary milieu of theological sort of scholarship. They're definitely not secular. So, but I'm not aware of that. I mean, there are plenty of other conspiracies surrounding the Jesuits that may have greater or lesser degrees of accuracy or plausibility around them, but I'm not really certain about that. And let me preface this by saying there's a whole lot, particularly concerning the Jesuits, that I am uncertain of, because a lot of what is available for examination is conjecture. It's just theorizing. So there's really not much. There's not much I can conclusively kind of point to say no, But I think that it's very apropos. It's very important that we keep these ideas of the name of Christ and within that context, that understanding that it wasn't written in Hebrew anywhere in the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that actually brings a lot of good clarity, especially with the tetragrammaton and the evolution to the pentagrammaton with the insertion of the shin from Yod He Vav He to Yod He Shin Vav He. It took me a little bit to actually get that one, but yeah. And you brought up a good point that I was gonna draw attention to as well. Something I was wondering about because exactly like you're saying in the New Testament, I believe that's the only time Jesus comes into the equation. And the sources are originally Greek texts, like you said, like with the Vulgate and whatnot. And another thing I found interesting was, and I wonder if you've heard of this book called The Life of Saint Issa, The Lost Years of Jesus in India. It was published in 1894 by a Russian war correspondent named Nicholas Notovich. He claimed that while he was at some monastery, he had learned about some document called The Life of Saint Issa, Best Sons of Men. Issa, I guess, being the Arabic name of Jesus in Islam. According to the alleged found scrolls, Jesus abandoned Jerusalem at the age of 13. He went somewhere else, intending to improve and perfect himself and the divine understanding and to study the laws of the great Buddha. He went somewhere else, Pini or Puri Jagana or something like that. Studied the Vedas under Brahmin priests, spent 6 years in Pyri and Rigu near something else, the ancient seat of Hindu learning, then went to the Himalayas and spent time in Tibetan monasteries studying Buddhism, and through Persia returned to Jerusalem at age 29. So it's obviously super controversial. Maybe the documents were all bullshit and the story was just complete forgery. I don't know, but I wonder if you have ever heard of this claim or this dude in this book, and if you have any conclusions or opinions about it.
Yeah, actually, I have. I've read portions of it and commentary on it. And also something I'm not sure if they're related directly. But another thing called the Tibetan Gospels. So when I was a kid, I want to say maybe like 13 or 14, just really getting into all of this stuff after this very strange meditative experience. My first time meditating, I like went out of body. It was crazy. And I started really getting into this stuff. And of course, you're 13 years old and you're not going to you're not going to open up like Strong's Greek lexicon. You don't even know what that is. So you're going to go straight to the internet. And there was this very interesting kind of new agey resource called The Reluctant Messenger of Religion and Science. And so he had published little vignettes and excerpts and dialogues in almost like a Socratic kind of discursive way. And it was very palatable to me because of the idea of a perennial tradition, which I think also were what the Kabbalists, the Christian Kabbalists were getting at. They're kind of saying the same thing, but they're taking different approaches to it. So in things like Saint Issa and the Tibetan Gospels and things like this, you have this idea that there is a tradition that exists independently of religious dogma, and that some of the greatest teachers of all time somehow are initiated into or sort of tap that stream. And this is true even of like for instance, all the great Greek early philosophers claim are throughout the historical record are attested to have gone to Egypt for initiation and study. I mean, Thales, right? Solon, the lawgiver, Plato, Pythagoras. In Porphyry's Life of Pythagoras, he says that Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt astronomizing and geometrizing, and was initiated in no casual or superficial way. So there's this idea that you kind of, and again, to me, it's reminiscent of the hero's myth, that monomyth, the hero's journey, the call to adventure. I have to leave where I am to go and be initiated in the ways of the world, the secret traditions, and then only to come back exactly to the exact place I came from, and with eyes anew. And it's very interesting to me. But you have that idea of the great teachers and sages of the world, and I guess you'd call them, avatars in the some of the Eastern systems. They kind of tap into this underlying core philosophy, or at least come to deliver it. And so according to a lot of that stuff, Jesus was able to embody, to manifest in physical, concrete reality a lot of the things that he learned, right? He was a great teacher. I mean, even in the book pertaining to Saint Issa, the Gospel or Veda of Saint Issa, or whatever it ended up being, they're like astounded at how much this young kid knows about spirit, how much he intuitively understands. And that's also true in the Gospels, when it is mentioned that Christ would spend, as a young child, he would spend the afternoons in the Hebrew temples conversing with the rabbis, and they were like shocked at how much this kid knew about Hebrew law and things like that. So kind of this knack for it, an intuitive understanding of everything. Now, the Christian Kabbalists, on the other hand, that we were just discussing, they took the same idea from a different tack, which was a little bit more dogmatic, but still for their time kind of, stretching those boundaries, and thinking as far outside of the box as they were allowed without, having to suffer the death penalty or torture or imprisonment. They look back and they said, well, all of this Egyptian stuff and all of the stuff that the Hebrews learned from the Egyptians, Christ was the capstone. Everything that came before Christ was predicting him in one way or another, and kind of proves his existence. Proves the fact that that it's a reality. That he did fulfill the role of kind of completion, plerosai, as he says in the Gospels, the completion of the law. So you have it coming from kind of the same thing is being said in slightly different ways, from different schools of thought. Again, as to the historical veracity of something like that, I cannot attest, because it's been, what did I say, 13? It's been like 24 years really since I've taken a look at something at that book, or those writings, or whatever I was reading, the commentary behind it. But I do remember it kind of really drawing me in. Eastern stuff is typically more palatable, or at least it was in the place and time where I grew up. It was very, very heavily commoditized and therefore easily consumable, right? Wasn't that easy for me as a 15, 14-year-old to go walk into a library and ask for, Thomas Taylor's translation of On the Mysteries or something like that, or of like, Proclus and Elements of Theology. But it was super easy to get a hold of the Tao Te Ching and the Mahabharata and stuff like that. All that stuff was being republished through like Tarcher Penguin and all those kind of at the time niche imprints, and they were on the shelves of Barnes and Noble and stuff like that. And it was just way more palatable, and kind of the air of the time was saturated with Hatha yoga and Qigong and a lot of the Eastern stuff. So it did draw me in further to the Vedic traditions to see, well, if Christ went there to learn and he came back, if Jesus went there to learn and he came back as Christ, then what's going on over there? So, but what you got to remember is, so can you give me a date on that again real quick? When did that that Russian
1887? I think that was when that was published, and the documents he found, I'm not sure when they were allegedly dated or if they were ever actually found, or if they disappeared, or what's the scoop on all that. I'm not really sure.
I wouldn't be surprised. But the thing is that a lot of people don't really tend to extrapolate from this, is that why is it that there's this fixation on specifically the religions and practices of India and Eastern Asia at this time? And I mean, you look at the Theosophical Society, you look at, even in the early 20th century, Paramahansa Yogananda, kind of, even when the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was outed in the newspaper of 1880s London, right after the Horus scandal and the Crowley lawsuits and all that stuff between Mathis and Crowley over the intellectual property, the rituals of the Golden Dawn, and everything was laid bare out of legal necessity, without understanding that it was a Western tradition, right? They were talking about theurgy, and they were talking about, Samothracian mysteries and ancient Egypt. The papers made fun of them by having some advertisement or some wacky headline saying, making fun of the obligation, the ritual obligation of the neophyte ceremony of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which ended up, being released in court. It made fun of the obligation by saying, "Do you swear to your Swami?" or something like that. That's an Indian term that was never used and never associated with the Golden Dawn in its earliest iteration. Never. So, even back then, the Vedic stuff had penetrated, the mainstream consciousness, and this was because of, in 1858, England colonized India, and they went over there, and things like tea, right, began to be introduced and spices began to be introduced to England, and with it, because you had all these adventurers and people, writing about their sojourns in the East, very exotic, previously sort of inaccessible interior to them. They had began going over there under the auspices of the British Empire. If you had enough money, you could play ball, right? I mean, and so they'd go over on these expeditions, and they managed to found things like the East India Company and things like that, and they began to see the yogis, the siddhas, the I guess magicians, the medicine men who sat outside and contorted positions for hours, and their heart rate and their respiratory rates would drop, and they, some of that was them kind of seizing on this idea that, like, look, there's foreigners with fresh money, let's put on a show. That you see that even in places that have been colonized by England today, like places like where I just got back from, Egypt, for example. And that really is when that stuff began being imported wholesale into Western consciousness, really. So it makes sense to me that, like, particularly like a journalist, right? That, like, it's just, if you're a journalist, it's in your blood to sensationalize everything. But would, like Levy, right? Eliphas Levy he was a journalist. He wrote sensationally and cryptically, and you could read his books 40 times, like I have, and still extrapolate maybe 5 or 6 sentences that are worth anything. He said a lot, though. The guy said a lot, but how much of it was worth listening to, we're still not sure. The jury's out. So I tend to view things like that kind of syncretic, textually unverifiable or unsubstantiatable as yet sort of stuff as interesting, and maybe there's a spirit of truth, but it's not something I'm really gonna be able to, with any reliability, admit into my sort of interior library.
Definitely. Yeah, whether it was a mythologized depiction or whatever, it definitely seemed plausible, and it's a kind of always stuck with me. So I thought it was worth mentioning and kind of getting your
Sure.
thoughts on. And back to the Jesuits. So the Society of Jesus, as you have mentioned before in our previous conversations, this was founded by Saint Ignatius with 6 other guys in 1540 approximately. So way before the papacy, which I guess I didn't really realize until I was looking more into this. Um, and I followed the list of predecessors all the way down from Saint Ignatius. Uh, when I was going through, it was interesting because the popes, they have a bunch of the same names, a lot of like Clements, Innocents, Gregory's, Honorius's. A lot of them repeat throughout time. But anyway,
Yeah, well, they're titles like kings. Like once you take that position of power, you typically take like a regal name. It's kind of like a dynastic name. It's not their real name, obviously.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Um, so I kept going down from the predecessor to predecessor, and I hit Pope Benedict. What's IX in Roman numeral?
Nine,
Nine.
the ninth.
Pope Benedict the Ninth, aka Theophilus of Tusculum, 1012 to 1056. And it was interesting because he had 3 predecessors listed. He was the only one out of all of them that had 3 separate predecessors. So it was kind of weird. I just chose the one with the earliest date and then kept going down the list. But I finally
Well, let
hit
me ask you.
it. Go
Let me
ahead.
ask you real quick. You'd mentioned that Saint Ignatius of Loyola and sort of an entourage of other people. They founded the Society of Jesus in 1540, and then you said before the papacy. So what do you mean by that? Because the technically it's technically before like Vatican sovereignty, but it's not before the
Mm.
papacy.
Okay. Well, maybe you could illuminate me on that then, because yeah, I guess this was something I was wanting to get into because I had as I was going down, so I finally hit the last pope. It was Linus, Pope Linus, 67 AD, and there's like an image of him holding a 3-pronged cross and something else in his other hand. So that was the last pope I hit before his predecessor, I guess, was Saint Peter himself. Um, but then it doesn't say Pope Peter as his main title, but it said Saint Peter. Saint Peter's
Yeah.
papacy was 30 AD. So I guess he was a pope or wasn't a pope, and then that was
Well,
interesting. So I wasn't sure if he was like the first pope or if it was Linus after him.
well, here's the thing. So Pope, um, Pope comes from the Latin or Greek. It's kind of like a term of endearment. Papa, il Papa. It
Okay.
means
Father?
father, father, and it was an appellation, meaning a title that was commonly used to refer to the Bishop of Rome in the Catholic Church. So that's really what that's denoting. So it's a really interesting history. Uh Essentially what you get is so Christ dies, right? Or really Jesus dies. According to the Gospels, the Christ is resurrected. And on Pentecost, he 40 days after the resurrection, he tells the apostles to sequester themselves in the upper floor of an apartment until the Holy Spirit descends upon them. This is Pentecost. These are the tongues of flame that descended upon the apostles in this upper room apartment. And which endowed them with powers similar to the ones that Christ achieved or was granted after his baptism and the descent of the Holy Spirit. And then he says, go out into the world and preach my message. Preach the gospels, right? Gospel means good news. Preach the good news. Go to the ends of the earth. And so I believe it's St. Peter who decides to minister to Jewish community. And Paul, right, all the apostles at the time kind of have a little bit of a meeting and decide which way they're going to go. Paul being the only apostle who never met Jesus while in the flesh, but arguably was the most influential apostle in Christendom. That aside, they decide that they're going to go all their different directions, right? And Peter goes to Rome. Rome is one of the sites, it's the lion's den. They're still under Nero, he creates this place on Ager Vaticano, which is a small hill on the west bank of the river Tebere. And that's where we get the name Vatican from. That's the name of that hill, Vatican Hill. And Nero sets up on Vatican Hill this weird little circus, this like market and stuff like that. And he crucifies and tortures and martyrs Christians there regularly for public entertainment. So St. Peter goes and he essentially preaches the word of Christ. He preaches the gospel, the good news, and garners, he converts Hebrews, and he becomes episkopos of Rome. Episkopos is what we translate as bishop, and in Greek that means overseer. So these are the people who are in bishops, episkopoi. They are the people who are sort of in charge of the whole show administratively, regionally. But since Rome you have to look at it in terms of the historical context, not only before, during, but also after. Rome is the center of the known world, right? All roads lead to Rome. The Roman Empire covered the known world of the time. Mostly, right? The Gauls and the Germanic areas kind of evaded their influence for a really long time, successfully resisted that. They just weren't able to assimilate. But so he's in the heart. He's in the lion's den. He's in the heart of the empire, and he's converting Christians. And then later, right, 300 years later, Christianity somehow miraculously becomes the official religion of Rome. And so Rome becomes the seat of power. Whoever is the episkopos, the overseer of the Christian communities in Rome, is the head of the Catholic Church. And not only that, but the thing is, so there's this quote, I think it's from the Gospel of Matthew. It's really cool. I went to the Vatican. I went to Rome and I visited the Vatican in July of 2019. And it was a really interesting experience to me, especially as a lifelong, Catholic. I would consider myself philosophically, cosmologically, theologically, much more of a Gnostic now. But elements of Catholicism can exist in that. I know that just from experience, from being both. So it was a profound experience for me. But what's very interesting is in gigantic gold leaf across the wall of St. Peter's Basilica is the very dramatic quote from the Gospel of Matthew, where Christ says to Peter, tu est Petrus, et Petram edificabo ecclesia meam. And that in huge letters, right? Because it's the Latin, as you were saying, Vulgate, it's the Latin translation of the original Greek, that's what the Mass was done in, right? Look at that, right? Latin being the official language of Rome. The Tridentine Mass being the the sine qua non, the exemplar, the high ritual of Christianity until the 1960s, right? So even the language of Rome carried through Christianity. And what was I born in 1986? What was I baptized? Roman Catholic. But that Latin translation is basically, it means you are Peter, and Peter means rock. Okay, so that's just my aside. But he says, you are Peter, the rock upon which I will build my church. So there's this apostolic conferral. This is yours now. You're in charge. Christ says that to Peter directly in the Gospel of Matthew. So he's already kind of, by the time, those Gospels are being read and used, he's already the exemplar of Christianity. And it turns out that according to Christian law, or according to Christian lore, St. Peter is martyred on Vatican Hill in what is now Vatican Square. And they build in the 1500s the largest church in the world, St. Peter's Basilica, which is it's the centerpiece of the Vatican, really.
Wow. Okay, yeah. And so I was going to ask, because I thought it had related to the foundation of the Vatican, because Peter was originally Bishop of Antioch, which is present-day Turkey, and then next we have Pope Linus, and Pope Linus is in the Vatican, I guess, or maybe not, or maybe he's just in Rome. But I guess it seemed to me that the origins of the Vatican, or the Roman papacy, started with this Pope Linus dude. But okay, so Nero was before that. So do we know the original foundation of the Vatican? I've read it was built on top of like an old Druid temple, but did you say that it was built in the 1500s, or?
Well, let me just step back there. So there are later accounts that, like, sort of they come after the Acts of the Apostles. They come after them. But there are later accounts that say that Peter served as Bishop of Antioch for 7 years. But traditionally, he is, even if that is placed somewhere in there, because don't forget, these guys were like itinerant mystics. They were basically like, healers and magicians to a degree. They were endowed at their time. They were endowed with the same spiritual potency that Christ was after the descent of the Holy Spirit onto Christ and onto them. So they wandered around a lot in their conversions, but ultimately Peter was Bishop of Rome, and it was in the 9th century really that you begin to see the term Papa being used to refer as a term of reverence and respect to the Bishop of Rome. But the Vatican itself it was built in the 1500s on Vatican Hill at the site where it is rumored, or according to Christian lore, St. Peter was crucified and martyred in or near St. Peter's Square, and kind of built from there. Now, in 1929, it became its own sovereign nation. It's not very big. It's about, like an eighth the size of Central Park, but it is its own sovereign nation. And so people refer to it as the Vatican. And what the Vatican actually is it's a term that we use to refer to the like geographic headquarters of what is called the Holy See. And the Holy See is the seat of power for the Bishop of Rome, because he is historically, right, he is the heir to St. Peter, who is himself the heir to Christ, according to, Catholic doctrine, really.
So, okay, so we're looking at the papacy. Okay, so do you, in your estimation, in terms of it, I guess 9th century, I think you said, or before that, it was the Bishop of Rome in general, or the head of the Bishop of Rome, and then it moved in the 9th century to, like, I guess, official papacy in some regard.
Well, the thing is that they're the same thing. So in other words, the Pope today is still, his official title is the Bishop of Rome.
Oh, okay.
So they're not different. They're just like, it's like taxi driver or cab driver. It's like that. It's the same. It's two different ways of saying the same thing. So I mean, obviously, right? You see it a lot. It's just a tradition, but it's one of respect and one of consequence, because right, everybody knows what the Pope is, but also like, what does Pope mean? It means father. You know what I'm saying? Like, you are my spiritual father. It's deep reverence, profound respect, profound spiritual bond that many people feel towards the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of this idea of Saint Ignatius of Loyola and these 6 other guys that had allegedly uh founded the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, would you agree with that? Or how would you see the Society of Jesus? Do you see it as something that is just not something that had an official title until this particular time, or what would you make a
No,
separation?
I think I think the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, they were the specific invention of, at least this is my estimation, they were a consequence of Ignatius of Loyola. This was one of the most learned and spiritually disciplined men of his age. I mean, he was a polymath, he was a traveler, he was brilliant. Brilliant people aren't always the most moral, you know. I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm not saying
Yes.
anything definitive. As a matter of fact, it's mostly the intellectual people I have met in my life that are more likely to have, a lot of gray area in whether or not they're going to do the right or wrong thing, right? Because it's the intellective capacity. Well, it's a Chinese finger trap. Sometimes I say it all the time. People learn themselves stupid, but which is to say that, like, I'm no longer responding to life in a capacity of presence and duty and connection. I am an arm's length from reality because I need to analyze it. Okay, so I'm just going to throw that out there. Now, I do see a correlation between the Jesuits and the whole created by the disbandment of the Knights Templar, 200 years earlier. So the Napoleon is quoted as saying, and I don't really know if this is even factually accurate, right? Because Napoleon himself said, "What is history but a series of lies agreed upon?" But Napoleon Bonaparte is quoted as saying, and this is a charge that has been leveled against the Jesuits many times, that they are not a monastic missionary research and educational order. They're an army. They're an army of a particular agenda within the Catholic Church. And the Knights Templar were that army, the enforcement arm. But I feel that they had a much more, from what I understand, the Templars had a much more heart-based, morally centered sort of place from which they worked. One of the things that's also common to, like, those types of martial military, quasi-military orders in the church historically is that to temper them out, to even them out, or maybe to instill them with passion, right? They're dedicated to Saint Mary, to Theotokos, the God bearer, the carrier of Christ. And that was true of the Templars, and that's true of the Jesuits. Their patron saints, are Mary. But I see kind of that as like this dark inversion. It's like the Templars were a dog that you could rely on to be loyal when they agreed with your cause. And I feel like maybe, right, again, this is me just riffing. If I had to, make this kind of, let's say, arbitrary comparison, I would say that in my estimation, it very well could be that the Jesuits were a much more well-trained dog, which is why they're still around today, and the Templars had to go. So, so I think I tend to look at it that way. Again, charges can be leveled at anybody and any organization, particularly if there are certain clandestine meetings. You'd always fear what you don't understand. So I'm not even saying that I get behind the whole line that the Jesuits, we need to scapegoat, right? That's just what we do. We got to point at like one group of people and say it's your fault.
Yeah.
That's just, we've been doing that since the dawn of humanity, and frankly it's fucking ridiculous at this point. No nuance, no understanding of our own part to play in the ignorant contribution, the apathy that we truly have to allow these things to exist and to go on. You get to blame somebody else. That's the Jesuits, right? Yeah, we don't know a lot about them. They're a bunch of dudes. Screw them. So I'm being facetious to make a point. I don't know what the Jesuits do, what they are. Ostensibly from their website, I did consider getting involved maybe like 10 years ago. From their website, like they do missionary work. Again, but how much does that tell me?
Yeah. And so speaking of this like army like aspect, so there was the Templars, and then there's also the Knights of Malta. Do you know much about the Knights of Malta?
Yeah. So well, not much, but the Knights of Malta were, I believe, a precursor to the Knights Templar. You had the Knights of St. John, and then you had the Knights Malta, and then you had the Knights Templar. But what's interesting is after the disbandment of the Knights Templar, there were certain countries or locations within Europe where the Templars, because don't forget, there was never a Templar massacre. They were never massacred. They burned Jacques de Molay, their Grand Master, on Friday the 13th. Actually, no, he wasn't burned on Friday the 13th. They were arrested en masse by King Philip IV of France, his men. They were arrested en masse and then eventually completely disbanded. But Jacques de Molay, their Grand Commander, was burned at the stake. Many of the Templars were just exiled, said you got to go. They were never, they were never like slaughtered en masse. And you got to remember at this time, they were what for the time period was a quote unquote worldwide organization, meaning they were all over Europe and the known world at the time. So, how could the King of France arrest every Templar in every country? Couldn't do that. So they were, persona non grata in certain places, but there were certain countries that allowed them passage. So, for instance, Portugal was a country where the Knights Templar were granted asylum, and the king at the time allowed them to basically form another order called the Order of Christ. I'm drawing a blank here, but something like that, the Order of Christ. And they were allowed to sort of repossess their holdings, because that's really what it was all about. They were as individuals, they were forced to live in, poverty, celibacy, and obedience. They were monks. They were just monks that were able to, they were also knights, and they were able to kill. And so they took those vows of poverty, celibacy, or abstinence, and obedience. Poverty, chastity, obedience. Those three vows. So they didn't have any money as individuals, but they had a tremendous holding as a group. And so it was really the financial stuff that everyone seems to have been after at the time. So at least in part. And so the King of Portugal at the time allowed the Knight Templars to reorganize as this new order and be reinvested with their financial holdings and kind of, and you see a lot of that going on. So I mean, I'm not 100% certain how Knights Malta kind of play into that. I know that there's a large volume of conspiracy stuff about, the ancient, serpent temples or whatever they found in Malta and things like that, and some sort of dark, shady shit that was going on. But all of these things, traditionally, these quasi-monastic or religious orders of knights, they in my own estimation, they fulfilled more political roles than anything else, because what you got to remember is that the Vatican, the Vatican didn't exist, but the papacy, right, the church, didn't really have any way to defend itself before then. At the first crusade, the Pope basically had to he had to be like, volunteer, you'll go to heaven, and like laity were like just picking up swords and going to fight. He didn't have an army.
Yeah, I think I read or heard one was like associated more over time with moving into banking in Venice, probably like the Templars, and then I think Knights of Malta were more like the intelligence apparatus or something along these lines, kind of the Vatican. I don't know, but some major things to probably point out are, the things that happened with the Inquisition to combat what the Roman Catholic Church deemed heretical for individuals who rejected their assumed dictate on Christian doctrine. Me personally, in contemplating this, it kind of arises emotions of repulse and disgust, with a lifetime of imprisonment and torture for those of alternate beliefs, pretty much. And so when I think of the Vatican as a living symbol, to me, it is to a degree charged with particular concentrations of malevolence by virtue of the energetically potent memory that's just encapsulated within its very walls over time. But maybe that is something that is just because it is such a vast history that it's a lot more than just that. And people will always, or a lot of people tend to focus and concentrate on the darkest or the most negative aspects of things. So
I mean, the Borgias, how many shows and things like that and books have been written on them? Why? Because it's a Game of Thrones shit. It's fucking entertaining. You're not going to hear about the popes who like ate oatmeal, like, and brushed their horses. You're not going to hear about those guys. And there may have been hundreds of years worth of them. You look, and here's the thing. I'm not an apologist for Catholicism. I'm not, because at the end of the day, I just understand the energetic dynamics, the group psychology, the things that go into this stuff. Anything that humans create will be endowed indelibly with our highest heights and our lowest lows, because they're human. And that's the mistake that Catholics make, that in my opinion, right? You're putting your faith in a human being. You're putting your faith in a human being, maybe a small group. They're not infallible. You can't give any group of people, the carte blanche that infallibility grants a human being. Doesn't matter how spiritual they are, they're still living here, and the issue is, we see it with bands, we see it with corporations. Anytime something gets big, administratively heavy, an egregore is created that serves one purpose, its own existence. And that's it. And then everything else is just a costume. It's just a trappings. It's how I got here. And that's essentially what happens time and time and time again. And people want to try and change the system. You don't change the system. The system changes you, if anything. So you have to get out of the system. And that's the whole message of Christ. You have to leave the fucking system alone. It sucks. It's hard. There's no other way. There's no other way. There is no other way. So that's the whole fucking thing, whether you like it or not, right? Because we're not arbiters of universal law. That's not what we get to do in this lifetime. We either follow the dictates of everything that's around us, one way or the other. You opt out and ascend, or you play the game, and God help you, God be with you, God bless you. You know, like that's just the way it is. And how many millennia are we going to sit here and try and, you know, point our fingers at systems and institutions? Point your finger at yourself.
Mm.
You know, that's the whole message there. But, you know, there's a lot that goes into, you know, this idea of the Vatican and the papacy and stuff like that. It's like, it doesn't represent all Christians, you know, it doesn't represent all Catholics, you know. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things. But I'm not an apologist for it. I just understand it for what it is, because look at what, and I think I might have said this to you. I can't remember if it was in private or on a podcast, but you want to talk about crusades, you want to talk about the Inquisition. Let's talk for a second about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where we vaporized populations of men, women, and children. We turned them into fucking dust in minutes, and religion didn't do that. Okay.
100%.
So it's people, it's us. It's anytime we try and get back in the game, you know, we just fuck it up, because we're not here to change the game. We're here to get out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hilarious. One of my first posts on my podcast Instagram was an image of Jesus with a quote, and it said "fuck the system." So
Yeah.
so-
That's
and
really, you know, and that's all the thing, you know, but that's, to me, that's Christ. And
yeah,
that's not, people want to defang and declaw Christ, but when he needed to, he whipped the moneylenders. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
You know, he used force when he needed to, and typically he railed against hypocrisy. That was the main thing. If you look at the Bible, that was the thing that, like, where he got set off. Hypocrisy. You know, people pretending to be one thing, you know, pointing their fingers at everything else but themselves.
yeah. And yeah, just to be fair and acknowledge the more, I guess, black pill aspects, like in terms of modern day, you know, it's sort of like this governing body and this monarchical nature of this thing, this globalist imperial aspiration to rule earth, essentially this notion that there's no salvation outside of the Catholic Church per the Council of Trent, this Council of Trent that every pope swears to uphold, that contains the condemnation of heretics as well as papal bulls, being public decrees, letters, charters issued by former popes, you know, calling for kings to kill heretics and all of this sort of thing. So the idea of the Pope's temple power, with the belief that he is endowed with the power and authority to rule the governments of all nations. I believe that's included in some of the documentation that they still to this day take their oaths with. These sort of things are, you know, completely antithetical to the freedoms that we value in terms of especially like religious freedom. And so this Jesuit sort of inclination in this regard towards the destruction of Protestantism and the restoration of the Pope's supremacy globally. So I guess I'm curious, like, what's your take on all that? Like, you know, I'm curious, like, because I know that I think to this day they haven't like eradicated a lot of those like papal bulls and these things that are, you know, still like in the past have called for, you know, kings to kill heretics and then what they deem as heretical and all of this stuff. So I guess that's just maybe a philosophical question of reformation or probably things that
Well,
people argue about endlessly.